Libertarian throughout modern European history meant socialist anarchist. It meant the socialist movement, the workers' movement and the socialist movement, it sort of broke into two branches, roughly. One statist, one anti-statist. The statist branch led to Bolshevism and Lenin and Trotsky and so on. The anti-statist branch, which included Marxists, left Marxists, Pannekoek, Rosa Luxemburg, others, kind of merged more or less into an amalgam with a big strain of anarchism into what was called Libertarian Socialism. So libertarian in Europe always meant socialist. Here it means ultra, Ayn Rand or Cato Institute or something like that. But that's a special U.S. usage having to do with a lot of things quite special about the way the United States developed, and this is part of it. There it meant, and always meant to me, the anti-state branch of socialism, which meant a highly organized society, completely organized, and nothing to do with chaos, but based on democracy all the way through. That means democratic control of communities, of workplaces, of federal structures built on systems of voluntary association spreading internationally. That's traditional anarchism. At least, anybody can have the word if they like, but it's a mainstream, probably the mainstream of traditional anarchism. And it has roots, coming back to the United States, it has very strong roots in the American working class movements. So if you go back to, say, the 1850s, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, so right around the area where I live, in eastern Massachusetts, textile plants and so on, the people working in those plants were in part young women coming off the farms. They were called factory girls. So the women come to the farms and work in the textile plant. Some of them were Irish, immigrants in Boston, and that group of people. They had an extremely rich and interesting culture. They're kind of like my uncle who never went past fourth grade. Very educated, reading modern literature. They didn't bother with European radicalism. That had no effect on them. But the general literary culture they were very much part of, and they developed their own conceptions of how the world ought to be organized. They had their own newspapers. In fact, the period of the freest press in the United States was probably around the 1850s. In the 1850s, the scale of the popular press, meaning run by factory girls in Lowell and so on, was the scale of the commercial press, or even greater. And these were independent newspapers, a lot of interesting scholarship on them. You can read them now. They were not known, just spontaneously, without any background, and they never heard of Marx or Bakunin or anyone else. They developed the same ideas. They thought that from their point of view, what they called wage slavery, renting yourself to an owner, was not very different from chattel slavery, what they were fighting the Civil War about. And you have to recall that in the mid-19th century, that was a common view in the United States. For example, it was the position of the Republican Party. It was Abraham Lincoln's position. It's not an odd view that there isn't much difference between selling yourself and renting yourself. So the idea of renting yourself, meaning working for wages, was degrading. It was just an attack on your personal integrity. And they despised the industrial system that was developing, that was destroying their culture, destroying their independence, their individuality, constraining them to be subordinate to masters, there was a tradition of what was called republicanism in the United States. We're free people, the first free people in the world. This was destroying and undermining that freedom. This was the core of the labor movement all over, and included in it was the assumption, just taken for granted, that I'm quoting, those who work in the mills should run them. In fact, one of their main slogans, I'll just quote it, was they condemned what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. That idea that the new spirit, that you should only be interested in gaining wealth and forgetting about your relations to other people, they regard it as just a violation of fundamental human nature and a degrading idea.
You've repeatedly defined anarchism as the view that the burden of proof is on the authority, and if that burden fails to be met, then the authority is illegitimate and should be dismantled. But you also seem to use the terms anarcho-syndicalism and our theme for today, libertarian socialism, interchangeably with anarchism. Is there a difference between these terms, and if so, can you describe the differences?
Well, first of all, anarchism covers a very wide range. I mean, what you just quoted seems to me like a kind of a core principle of anyone who's involved anywhere in anarchist movements should at least accept that authority is not self-justifying. Hierarchic institutions, authoritarian structures, structures of dominance and control have a burden of proof. I mean, they're not self-justifying. They have to meet a challenge. They should be challenged. And I think that everyone ought to be an anarchist in that sense. It doesn't carry any, then come further questions about what you do about it. But it ought to be challenged, and if it can't meet the burden of proof, which is usually the case, though not always, then they should be dismantled. This should be done everywhere, from families to international affairs, professions, science, whatever it is. Actually, it's kind of striking that in some domains it's just taken for granted. Like in the sciences, if you're science students, it's assumed that the task for students is to challenge. You're not supposed to just copy what you heard. The fields would die if they did. So you're supposed to challenge, request, demand evidence and proof, and if you can't find it, change it. But that ought to extend to all of life. Now, anarcho-syndicalism is a little bit different. That is a particular brand of anarchism which was particularly concerned with things like workers' control by working people of production, the means of production, decisions over production. It's like a kind of a core part of it. That's the syndicalist part. Libertarian socialism is just the traditional word for anarchism. It's a French term originally, and so if you take a look at the French journals, Socialisme, Libertaire, they're just anarchist journals. It's the non-statist component of the anarchist tradition, and a lot of it was anarcho-syndicalist in character. So one of the main French writers, Daniel Guérin, published major volumes on libertarian socialism. He's basically an but dealing with the anarcho-syndicalist variant of it. Of course, there are plenty of other things that call themselves anarchist. So this is by no means the whole story.
Libertarian socialists envision and work to create a, predictably enough, libertarian socialist society. What would be the core features? What are the core features of that theory? What are the core features of that society?
Well, apart from accepting the general principle of anarchism, it tends to concentrate on the productive system. So, for example, workers' control in industry, control of other institutions by people who participate in them. It's not inconsistent with what's sometimes called communitarian anarchism, which concentrates on control of communities by participants. In fact, they generally, both groups think these ought to be integrated. It's a question of where the focus of attention is. But I don't think they're real conflicts. It's just a question of what's prioritized, what's the center of concern and activity, what other things will flow from it. Partly tactical choices, partly ideas about where the source of creativity, power, search for freedom would be in a society. You can have different views on that.
When we speak about anarchism, sorry. When we talk about anarchism, it's often about people understand it as not being organized, as being a kind of chaos. But in fact, it's trying to find the institutions that can be effective but are minimally coercive. In a libertarian socialist society, what kind of institutions would that be?
Well, within the main libertarian socialist, especially anarcho-syndicalist tradition, what's assumed is it should be a highly organized society. It should be based on popular control at every level. So begins with, for example, control by working people of whatever institution they're working in, factory, offices, whatever it might be, and control of communities. And then these should be integrated through voluntary association. They could be regional. Then there should be federated structures that extend beyond, and on to organization of international society. But it should be highly organized, though controlled from below, not anything complex is going to have some degree of representative decision-making, but always under direct control and recall and so on. So it's kind of a, sort of pure democracy, if you want. Mm. In fact, the example, takes the major achievement of mainly anarcho-syndicalist development was libertarian Spain, and it didn't have a lot of time. It was wiped out pretty soon, but it was what developed rather quickly was a fairly organized society with a lot of interaction between agriculture and industry and communities and so on. Pretty successful economically, too.
Now, libertarian socialists traditionally insist that the organizational structure of our organizations must prefigure the desired society. So, for instance, if we want a direct democratic society, then we should use direct democracy here and now. Why is that so important?
Well, the traditional idea goes back to Bakunin, is that the way to carry out social change is to build the seeds of the future within the present society. To try to, what's really involved in social progress ultimately is a kind of change of consciousness, not just organization, but just letting different values and different concerns come to prevail. And the way that happens is through participation and action, not by reading about it. And one of the ways to do it is to start with direct democracy where you are. And there are a lot of ideas about how to do this. Work sharing, lots of possible, decision-making, common decision-making, and that helps. It's essential. I agree with this. It's essential for gaining an understanding of what a free democratic society might be like, even if it's a small group, let's say a publishing house with 10 people. And you learn, you experiment, you see what works, what doesn't work, you can go on to bigger things.
If one was to build a libertarian socialist organization, what would be the core features of it? What would be the core elements?
Well, core elements, first of all, would be authentic participation. That means everybody, not one person's a secretary, one person's a janitor, one person does the finance, and therefore you kind of automatically get a hierarchy of decision-making based on role in the system. But really participating. That doesn't mean everybody can do everything. Like, I can't be a surgeon, somebody else can. But it means that in anything that involves decision-making functions, it should really be shared. It should be true in, say, universities, like where I am, or publishing houses, or factories or anywhere else. That's the beginning. As soon as you do that, it just breaks down barriers among people. For one thing, it means, there is some kinds of work that nobody wants to do, but has to be done. Well, that has to be shared. If that's not shared, then you got a problem. But that can be instituted. A joint participation, decision-making can be instituted. If there is representation, immediate recall when under public, cooperative action. All of these things can be instituted on a very small scale and can spread to larger ones. And that, if it goes far enough, becomes a major organization.
Well, let me begin by referring to something that I've already discussed. That is, if it is correct, as I believe it is, that a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then, of course, it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and oppression and destruction and coercion that exist in any existing society, ours, for example, as a historical residue. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine, in which the creative urge, that I think is intrinsic to human nature, will in fact be able to realize itself in whatever way it will. I don't know all the ways in which it will.
Anarchism can be conceived as a kind of voluntary socialism, that is, a libertarian socialist or anarcho-syndicalist or a communist anarchist in the tradition of, say, Bakunin and Kropotkin and others, had in mind a highly organized form of society, but a society that was organized on the basis of organic units, organic communities, and generally they meant by that the workplace or the neighborhood or both. And from those two basic units, involving the place where a person works and spends his creative energies and the place where he lives in relation to his neighbors and others around him, from those two basic units there could derive, through federal arrangements, a highly integrated kind of social organization, which might be national or even international in scope, where decisions could be made over a substantial range, but by delegates who are always part of the organic community from which they come and are returned to it and are revocable and in general would live there, in fact.
So it doesn't mean a society in which there is, literally speaking, no government so much as a society in which the primary authority and source of authority comes, as it were, from the bottom up and not from the top down, where representative democracy, as we have it in the United States and in Britain, would be regarded as a form of from the top down authority, even though ultimately the voters decide.
Well, representative democracy, as in, say, the United States or Great Britain, would be criticized by an anarchist of this school on really two grounds. First of all, because there is a monopoly of power centralized in the state, and secondly, and critically, because representative democracy is limited to the political sphere and in no way, in no serious way, encroaches on the economic sphere. And anarchists of this tradition have always held that that democratic control of one's productive life is at the core of any serious human liberation, or for that matter, any significant democratic practice. That is, as long as individuals are compelled to rent themselves on the market to those who are willing to hire them. And as long as their role in production is simply that of ancillary tools, then there are striking elements of coercion and oppression that make talk of democracy very limited, if even meaningful.
Don't these precedents suggest that there is something inherently pre-industrial about the applicability of libertarian ideas in this way, that it necessarily presupposes a rather rural, simple society in which the technologies of production are fairly simple, in which the economic organization tends to be small-scale and localized, and in which all the problems which we associate with modern industrial society just aren't there?
Well, let me separate that into two questions. One, how anarchists have felt about that, and two, what I think is the case. As far as anarchist reactions to that, there are two. There has been an anarchist tradition, which was, and one might think, say, of Kropotkin as a representative, which had much the character that you describe. On the other hand, there's another anarchist tradition that develops into anarcho-syndicalism, which simply regarded anarchist ideas as the proper mode of organization for a highly complex, advanced industrial society. And that tendency in anarchism merges, or at least interrelates very closely with a variety of left-wing Marxism, the kind that one finds in, say, the Council Communists that grew up in the Luxemburgian tradition and that is later represented by Marxist theorists like, say, Anton Pannekoek and who developed a whole theory of workers' councils in industry and who was himself a scientist and astronomer, very much part of the industrial world, Dutch Marxists. Now, it's the latter. Now, so which of these two views is correct? I mean, is it necessary that anarchist concepts belong to the pre-industrial phase of human society, or is it the rational mode of organization for a highly advanced industrial society? Well, I myself believe the latter. That is, I think that industrialization and the advance of technology raises possibilities for self-management over a broad scale that simply didn't exist in an earlier period, and that, in fact, this is precisely the rational mode for an advanced and complex industrial society, one in which workers can very well become masters of their own immediate affairs, that is, direction of and control of the shop, but also can be in a position to make the major substantive decisions concerning the structure of the economy, concerning social institutions, concerning planning regionally and beyond, because they can have, in fact, objectively now, that is, technology permits and industrialization permits, institutions do not permit them to have control over the requisite information, the relevant training to understand these matters. A good deal can be automated. Much of the necessary work that is required to keep a decent level of social life going can be really consigned to machines, at least in principle, which means humans can be free to undertake the kind of creative work which may not have been possible objectively in early stages of the Industrial Revolution.
I'd like to pursue in a moment the question of the economics of an anarchist society, but could you sketch in a little more broadly the kind of political constitution of an anarchist society as you would see it in modern conditions? Would there be political parties, for example? What forms of government, residual forms of government, would in fact remain?
Well, let me sketch what I think would be perhaps a rough consensus, and one that I think is essentially correct. Beginning with these two modes of immediate organization and control, namely organization and control in the workplace and in the community. One can imagine a network of workers' councils at a higher level, representation across a factory or across branches of industry or across crafts, and on to general assemblies of workers' councils that can be regional and national and international in character. And from another point of view, one can project a system of governance that involves local assemblies, again, federated regionally, dealing with regional issues, crossing crafts, industries, trades, and so on, and again, general at the level of the nation or beyond through federation and so on. Now, each of these, and exactly how these would develop and how they would interrelate and whether you need both of them or only one, well, these are matters over which anarchist theoreticians have debated, and many detailed proposals exist. And I don't feel competent to take a stand. In fact, I think these are questions that pretty much would have to be worked out.
But there would not, for example, be direct national elections and political parties organized from coast to coast, as it were, or from north to south in Britain to win those kind of elections. Would that? Because if there were, that would presumably create a kind of a central authority which would be equal to the idea of anarchism.
Right. No, the idea of anarchism is that delegation of authority is rather minimal. That is, participants at any one of these levels of government, representatives at any one of these levels of government, should be directly responsive to the organic community in which they live. And in fact, the optimal situation would be that participation in one of these levels of government should, on the one hand, be temporary, and even during the period when it's taking place, should be only partial. That is, the members of a workers' council who are, for some period, actually functioning to make short-run decisions that other people don't have the time to make, should nevertheless be, in part, also continuing to do their work as part of the workplace or neighborhood community in which they belong. Now, as for political parties, my feeling is that an anarchist society would not forcefully prevent political parties from arising. In fact, anarchism has always been based on the idea that any sort of Procrustean bed, any sort of system of norms that's imposed on social life will constrain and very much underestimate its energy and vitality, and that all sorts of new possibilities of voluntary organization may develop that we may not even think of today at a higher level of material and intellectual culture. But I think it is fair to say that insofar as political parties are felt to be necessary, anarchist organization of society will have failed. That is, it should be the case, I would think, that where there is direct participation in self-management in economic and social affairs, then factions, conflicts, differences of interest and idea and opinion, which should be welcomed and cultivated, will be expressed at every one of these levels. Why they should fall into 2 or 3 or N political parties, I don't quite see. I think that the complexity of human interest and life that does not fall in that fashion. Parties represent basically class interests, or largely
classes
so.
would not exist in.
And classes would have been eliminated or transcended in such a society.
Historically, have there been any sustained examples on any substantial scale of societies which approximated to the anarchist ideal?
There are small societies, small in number, that have, I think, done so quite well, and there are a few examples of large-scale libertarian revolutions which were largely anarchist in their structure. As to the first, small societies extending over a long period, I myself think the most dramatic example is perhaps the Israeli kibbutzim, which for a long period, may or may not be true today, really were constructed on anarchist principles, that is, of direct worker control, integration of agriculture, industry, service, personal life on an egalitarian basis with direct and, in fact, quite active participation in self-management, and were, I should think, extraordinarily successful. A good example of a really large-scale anarchist revolution, or largely anarchist revolution, in fact, the best example, to my knowledge, is the Spanish Revolution in 1936. And, in fact, you can't tell what would have happened. That anarchist revolution was simply destroyed by force, but during the period in which it was alive, I think it was inspiring testimony to the ability of poor working people to organize and manage their affairs extremely successfully without coercion and control.
How far does the success of libertarian socialism or anarchism as a way of life really depend on a fundamental change in the nature of man, both in his motivation, his altruism, and also in his knowledge and sophistication?
I think it not only depends on it, but in fact, the whole purpose of libertarian socialism is that it will contribute to it. It will contribute to a spiritual transformation. Precisely that kind of great transformation in the way humans conceive of themselves and their ability to act, to decide, to create, to produce, to inquire. Precisely that spiritual transformation that
social thinkers from the left Marxist tradition, from Luxemburg, say, on over through anarcho-syndicalists have always emphasized. So on the one hand, it requires that spiritual transformation. On the other hand, its purpose is to create institutions which will contribute to that transformation.